Hello and welcome to Latin American Victory, a video blogging channel about Latin America and Latinos in the U.S. and alternate history. What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and the Danish invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today, and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments. The last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, and then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There is a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image, and sometimes reality, is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There is a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America and a more Latino or less racist American society. This is the second of 32 planned videos. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story, alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. The Pacific Northwest was one of the last places in North America conquered by Europeans. In Alaska, Russians carried out genocide against Inuits and enslaved the survivors. The British didn't start colonizing until almost 1800. American invaders didn't arrive until the 1830s. To the south, California, both Alta and Baja, had been colonized by Spanish missionaries and soldiers starting in the 1680s. This took Spaniards over 80 years to force 1 million California natives into dozens of missions and presidios. This was slavery in all but name, killing hundreds of thousands with disease, forced labor, and starvation. Spaniards did try to invade farther north, from Alaska to what is today Oregon. There were 13 expeditions, from 1 to 3 ships each, with up to 90 men each invasion, 2 forts, numerous claims, and many place names left behind. Probably the most famous is Valdez, Alaska, mispronounced Valdez by locals, notorious for the oil spill in the late 1980s. These Spanish attacks were from the 1780s to 1800. Some failed, others were not followed up on or supported. Had they succeeded and then become independent, it becomes the Latin American nation of Nutka, spelled N-U-T-C-A, named after the Nutka, N-O-O-T-K-A, whose own name for themselves is Nutca. It would stretch from bordering Alaska to Oregon. Spanish expeditions almost led to a war with Britain. If Spain, allied with Napoleon, defeated Britain, the region becomes a Spanish colony. This means in 30 years there could be perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 Spanish colonists, soldiers, officials, and missionaries in the Pacific Northwest colony of Nutka, before the independence movement starts to affect it. The colony likely is a captaincy like Cuba or the Philippines. Nutka would have been a separate territory with hundreds of native nations, supported by whaling, sealskins, and the fur trade. There are 125 tribes in Washington state alone, and over 200 in British Columbia. The nation of Nutka would start off with at least 300,000 natives, likely far more since there would be a higher survival than under the British, and for certain more than under American conquest. Russian colonists in neighboring Alaska numbered under 2,000. They carried out brutal genocide in their treatment of their natives, and there were frequent revolts, but a war between Spain and Russia over Alaska is unlikely. It was at the edge of both empires' limits, and both were entirely occupied with either fighting Napoleon or being allied to him. If either military in these colonies tries to war on the other, the results could be undone by the Allied agreements in the Congress of Vienna. Nutka could expand even more if Spain offers to buy the rest of Alaska from Russia. Spain and Russia had little more than formal ties, no real relations between each other at this time, except technically as allies during some of the Napoleonic Wars. Russian troops at that time were fighting Tlingits in southeast Alaska. Spaniards could also choose to ally with them to defeat Russia, whose rule had been downright genocidal, killing most Alaskan natives. Spanish monarchs by this time had been under the new laws for almost 250 years, outlawing arbitrary killings of natives, and mostly the laws were enforced. But Spain had an unpopular and incompetent prime minister, Godoy, and it will be in the middle of a very brutal war against Napoleon's invasion in 1808. Spain won't devote much effort to Nutka. An independence movement in the new colony will begin. Spanish colonies will be outnumbered by natives at least 30-1. There were similar revolts in New Mexico and California, but Nutka is too remote to remain part of Mexico as New Mexico and California did. The U.S. perhaps never extends to the Pacific. Perhaps California if the U.S. wins its war with Mexico. It is very possible the U.S., under Polk and Manifest Destiny, goes to war to seize part or all of Nutka. Possibly Nutka allies with Mexico during the U.S.-Mexico War. But unlike Mexico, there is no reason Nutka would be divided and have gone through many revolts within. If the U.S.-Mexico War never happens, Nutka certainly survives until today. James Polk was the main one responsible for the U.S.-Mexico War, and his election was a fluke. There are many ways it could have been avoided. Today, the area that might have become Nutka has at least 17 million people. Cities like Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland still begin because they are ideal for trade. But they have Spanish names and mostly non-white people, primarily native or mixed. There are also likely large border towns with California, that is still part of Mexico, and with the U.S. in what is today Idaho, and with Canada along the Rocky Mountains. Under this scenario, Nutka is part of Latin America, Spanish-speaking and culturally very mixed, never segregated like the U.S. and Britain with many mestizos or mixed people, and later to be joined by many Asian immigrants. Under this scenario, Canada has no Pacific coast either. The U.S. not only has no west coast, it does not have Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, or control of the Philippines for 50 years. Possibly the U.S. never is at war with Japan during World War II. It's possible instead Nutka fights off Japanese attacks near its border with Russian Alaska, or even on its Navy bases, launched from Japanese-conquered Hawaii. But there's still no reason Japan would have lost anyway, exhausted by fighting China or crushed by the Soviets once they finished defeating the Nazis. Nutka would today have a population almost the size of Chile's and larger than Bolivia's, with likely more territory and prosperity. The Spanish language would unite the land enough to make it a nation. But Spanish political culture would not have been around long enough to overpower local traditions of democracy and equality. Native peoples like the Nutka practice potlatching, wealth distribution, ensuring nothing like the corrupt feudal or caudillo traditions from Latin America cripple the new nation. Nutka, not Costa Rica, is most likely pointed to as an example of the best of Latin America. This is the end of the second video. I look forward to your comments and questions and will answer as soon as I can. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss, what if Mayas drive out the Spaniards?